Hi there, welcome back. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to subscribe. Now let's begin. The wind howled through the barren trees of Gateshead, rattling the windows of the grand, cold mansion where young Jane Eyre sat, curled up in the corner of the Red Room. It was a place of punishment, a prison within the house, where she had been locked away for a crime she did not commit, resisting her cruel and spoiled cousin, John Reed. The Reeds had taken her in out of obligation, not love. Her uncle had once promised to care for her, but he had long since passed, leaving Jane at the mercy of his cold-hearted wife, Mrs. Reed. She had no allies in this house, only the disdain of her aunt, the cruelty of her cousins, and the indifferent scorn of the servants. Jane's small hands trembled as she wiped away the tears that blurred her vision. The Red Room was where her uncle had died, and its oppressive silence bore down on her like a weight. The deep crimson drapes and mahogany furniture created a suffocating atmosphere, and Jane could almost hear whispers in the dark, echoes of the past, or perhaps the cries of her own despair. Suddenly, the door creaked open. It was Bessie, the only servant who showed her any small kindness. "Miss Jane," she whispered, stepping inside, her voice laced with concern, "you'll catch your death in this cold." Jane looked up, her large, intelligent eyes filled with defiance. "I do not care," she said. "No one does." Bessie sighed and knelt beside her. "You're too young to speak like that. One day you'll find your place, child." But Jane knew better. She had no place. Not here, not in this grand house filled with cruelty. She would always be the unwanted orphan. That night, as Jane lay awake on the hard bed, her mind burned. With one thought, she had to escape Gateshead. Somehow, someday, she would leave behind the suffocating walls of this place and carve out a life of her own, a life where she would no longer be silent. The morning light filtered weakly through the heavy drapes of Gateshead Hall, casting long shadows across the walls. Jane sat at the breakfast table in silence, her bruised pride throbbing more painfully than the welts on her arm from John Reed's latest assault. Across from her, Mrs. Reed's sharp eyes flicked over Jane with disdain, as though she were something foul to be tolerated. Jane had long since learned that arguing was futile. Resistance only invited further punishment. But today, something inside her burned hotter than before, a quiet fire, one that refused to be extinguished. "Jane," Mrs. Reed said coldly, setting down her teacup, "I have made arrangements for you." Jane stiffened. "Arrangements?" "You will be leaving Gateshead," her aunt continued, her tone void of emotion. "A place more suitable for a girl like you has been found." Jane's heart pounded. Could it be true? Escape, freedom, however uncertain, was within reach. "You are to be sent to Lowood Institution," Mrs. Reed continued, a cruel smile tugging at her lips. "A school for orphaned girls. They will teach you discipline, obedience." Jane's initial spark of hope dimmed. She knew nothing of Lowood, but from Mrs. Reed's expression, it was not a kindness. Still, anything was better than the suffocating cruelty of Gateshead. The following morning, a dark-cloaked man arrived, Mr. Brocklehurst, the school's headmaster. His face was long and severe, his mouth perpetually twisted into a frown, as though displeased with the world itself. Mrs. Reed led Jane into the drawing room, where Brocklehurst eyed her with a gaze that sent a chill down her spine. "Is she a good child?" he asked, his voice sharp with judgment. Mrs. Reed did not hesitate. "She is deceitful," she said smoothly, "a wicked, ungrateful girl. I trust that at Lowood she will be taught humility." Jane's hands clenched into fists at her sides, anger rising like bile in her throat. She wanted to scream the truth, that Mrs. Reed was the liar, that she had been tormented, not the tormentor. But she knew it would do no good. Instead, she stood tall and met Brocklehurst's eyes. "I am not deceitful," she said, her voice steady. Mrs. Reed's lips curled. "You see? Such arrogance." Brocklehurst merely nodded. "She will learn." That afternoon, Jane was bundled into a carriage, her meager belongings stuffed into a worn satchel. She did not look back at Gateshead as the horses pulled away. She had no love for that house, no nostalgia to weigh her down. Whatever awaited her at Lowood, it would be hers to face. For the first time in her life, Jane Eyre was truly alone. The journey to Lowood was long and cold. Jane sat huddled in her seat, watching the barren countryside roll past the rain-smeared carriage windows. The further she traveled from Gateshead, the more a strange sensation grew within her, not fear, not grief, but something close to relief. By the time they arrived at Lowood Institution, the sky had turned an iron gray, and a biting wind howled through the narrow valley where the school stood. The building was dark and imposing, its stone walls damp with the touch of endless mist. As Jane stepped out of the carriage, she caught the scent of burning peat and something bitter, perhaps neglect, perhaps despair. A woman with sharp features and severe black clothing greeted her. "You are the new girl?" she asked. "Yes," Jane said. The woman, whom she soon learned was Miss Temple, gave her a brief nod and led her inside. The hallways were cold, lined with rows of wooden benches and dimly lit lamps casting flickering shadows on the stone walls. That night, Jane was introduced to the harsh reality of Lowood. She slept in a long dormitory filled with rows of narrow, hard beds, the blankets so thin they barely provided warmth. The other girls, pale, thin, their dresses mended beyond recognition, moved about with quiet obedience. There was no laughter, no chatter, only the shuffling of tired feet and the occasional muffled cough from the damp air. The next morning, Jane learned what true hardship was. Breakfast was a bowl of burnt porridge, too bitter to swallow, yet no one dared complain. Lessons were long and rigid, held in a freezing classroom where their ink often froze in its pots. The teachers, under the rule of Mr. Brocklehurst, were strict and unyielding. It was in that bleakness that Jane found her first friend, Helen Burns. Helen was unlike anyone Jane had ever met. She bore the injustices of Lowood with a quiet patience, never complaining when scolded unfairly, never flinching when struck with a cane. She was intelligent, always lost in a book when she had a free moment, her mind drifting far beyond the walls of Lowood. One afternoon, as they sat together during a rare break, Jane watched as a teacher reprimanded Helen for a trivial mistake, striking her hands with a thin rod. Helen accepted the punishment without protest. "How can you bear it?" Jane asked in a hushed voice once the teacher was gone. Helen smiled gently. "Because anger does nothing, Jane. If I let it consume me, I would be no better than those who hurt me." Jane frowned. But it is not fair. No, Helen agreed. But life is often unfair. We must find our strength elsewhere. Jane did not understand Helen's quiet resilience, but she admired it. For the first time in her life, she had someone to talk to, someone who did not see her as a burden. But Lowood was not just a place of discipline, it was a place of suffering. And soon Jane would learn just how deep that suffering could run. Winter descended upon Lowood with a cruel grip. The stone walls of the school, already damp and cold, seemed to freeze over entirely. The wind howled through the cracks in the windows, and frost formed on the inside of the dormitory walls. The girls huddled together at night, their thin blankets offering little protection against the bitter chill. The harsh conditions made them weak. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs. Meals of burnt porridge, stale bread, and weak broth barely sustained them. Jane often felt a dull ache in her limbs, not from exhaustion alone, but from the creeping sickness that seemed to settle in the very air. Then came the fever. It began as whispers, one girl coughing in the night, another failing to rise for morning. Prayers. Soon whole rows of beds were filled with the fevered and dying. A typhus outbreak had gripped Lowood. The already fragile girls, starved and cold, fell like autumn leaves. The school became a house of illness, the air thick with the scent of sickness and despair. Jane watched in helpless horror as her classmates vanished one by one. The daily routine collapsed. Lessons were abandoned as entire dormitories were converted into sick wards. Teachers no longer punished disobedience. What use was discipline when death lurked in every shadow? And then Helen Burns fell ill. Jane found her one evening, lying in bed, her normally bright eyes dull with fever. Her breath was shallow, her once steady hands trembling. "You must tell them," Jane pleaded, kneeling beside her friend. "They must bring a doctor." Helen smiled, that same soft, knowing smile. "They know, Jane." Jane swallowed hard, gripping Helen's thin hand. "Then you will get better." Helen's fingers tightened around hers. "I do not fear death," she whispered. "It is only another journey, perhaps one where there is no more suffering." Tears welled in Jane's eyes. "But I will be alone." "You will not," Helen said, her voice weak but sure. "You have a fire inside you, Jane. You are not meant to fade." That night, Helen Burns passed away, her head resting gently on Jane's shoulder. Jane sat in silence long after her friend was gone, her heart heavy with a grief she had never known before. By spring, the fever had run its course, leaving behind empty beds and hollow-eyed survivors. The tragedy could no longer be ignored. Public outcry led to an investigation, revealing the cruelty and neglect that had festered under Mr. Brocklehurst's rule. He was removed from power, and Lowood was reformed. Its conditions improved, but for Jane, the damage had been done. She had learned a truth too young, that the world was cruel, that life could be stolen away in an instant, and yet she did not break. She would not let herself. Helen's words echoed in her heart. She would not fade. She would endure. As Lowood began to rebuild, so too did Jane. The trauma of the past year had shaped her, but it had not shattered her. She was different now, hardened by loss, tempered by hardship. The cruelest winters had passed, but a cold, quiet fire still burned within her, one that refused to be extinguished. In the years that followed, Jane's intellect and determination set her apart. She excelled in her studies, devouring books with the same hunger that had once driven her to escape Gateshead. She found solace in knowledge, in learning that there was more to the world than the walls of Lowood, more to life than the misery she had endured. At the age of 16, Jane was offered the position of a teacher at Lowood. It was not a position she had ever desired, but it was a lifeline. It offered her independence, a chance to take control of her own future. She accepted, and the next chapter of her life began. Though Jane's days were filled with the rigid duties of teaching, she never lost the sharpness of her mind. She taught the younger girls with patience and precision, encouraging them to find their voices in a world that seemed to demand their silence. She imparted to them the same quiet strength she had come to embody, urging them to endure, to rise above their circumstances. One day, as Jane stood in front of the class, her eyes fell on a new arrival, a girl with pale wide eyes and the quiet manner of someone who had already endured too much. The girl's name was Adele, and she had come to Lowood after the death of her mother, a French opera singer. There was something about Adele, something fragile and frightened, that reminded Jane of herself at that age. Adele's presence stirred a strange longing in Jane. The child had no one, just as she had once been no one. The instinct to protect her surged within Jane, and she took the girl under her wing. Adele was not a natural student, but Jane never lost patience with her. She saw in Adele a kind of vulnerability she had long ago buried in herself, and Jane would not allow the same cruelty to befall this child. It was in these years at Lowood, with her students and the echoes of her friend Helen in her heart, that Jane came to understand the deep, unspoken power of quiet resilience. It was not the loud, triumphant kind of strength that shook the earth, but the small, constant kind, the strength that bore silently through the years, through the hardship, through the loss. It was the kind of strength that carried her day by day closer to her own freedom. As Jane Eyre approached her 20s, the foundation of her life at Lowood grew both more secure and increasingly stifling. She had gained a certain respect, both from the girls and from the administration. Her sharp mind and calm demeanor made her well-liked, but Jane could not ignore the gnawing feeling that had quietly settled in her chest. Something was missing. She had built a life of stability, but it was a life built on the echoes of hardship. The quiet, patient existence she had forged felt like a cage, however gilded. One evening, as she walked along the edge of Lowood's grounds, staring out over the misty hills, Jane's thoughts turned to the world beyond. She had never seen more than the dreary, mist-laden landscape surrounding the institution. Her life had been shaped by loss, by lessons learned in silence and struggle, but she had not yet truly lived. She was not the same girl who had left Gateshead behind. She was stronger, wiser, but still yearning for something beyond the constraints of Lowood. And so, with a quiet resolve, Jane made a decision. It was time to leave. It was not an easy decision. She had built a life at Lowood, one that had allowed her to teach, to care for Adele, to help the next generation of girls find their own strength. But it had become clear that if she stayed, she would be forever trapped in the echo of past wounds. She needed to seek something more, to find her place in the world beyond the walls of Lowood. When the time came, Jane sent word to the school's headmistress that she would be departing for a new opportunity. Adele would remain behind, still, a student at Lowood, and Jane was certain she would be all right. She had taught her well, as Helen Burns had once taught her. Now Jane had to trust that Adele would find her own strength. With little more than her few belongings and the quiet determination that had carried her through the years, Jane boarded a carriage to a new destination, Thornfield Hall. It was a place she had heard of in passing, a grand house, far from Lowood, where she had been offered a position as governess. As the carriage rumbled away from Lowood, Jane looked back one last time, feeling a strange mixture of regret and relief. She was leaving behind the only home she had ever known, but she was also leaving behind the woman she had been. A new chapter awaited, one where she could finally begin to carve out a future that was her own. The journey was long, but Jane's heart was quiet. She had walked through the fire and emerged stronger. Now she was ready to face whatever the world beyond Lowood had in store, and perhaps, just perhaps, she would find a place where she could live, truly live, with all the strength she had gathered. Thornfield Hall stood on the edge of a wide moor, its imposing stone facade both welcoming and foreboding, as if it had stories to tell, but kept them hidden beneath layers of ivy and thyme. The house was far grander than Lowood, its tall windows and stately entrance promising comfort and security. Yet something in the air felt different, charged with an energy Jane could not quite place, but one that seemed to vibrate against her skin. When Jane arrived, she was greeted by Mrs. Fairfax, the housekeeper, an elderly woman with a kind face, but a stern manner. She showed Jane to her quarters, a modest yet comfortable room overlooking the expansive grounds. As Jane unpacked, a sense of unease settled within her, though she could not quite explain why. She had been here only a short time, and yet there was something in the way the house seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something. The work at Thornfield was different from what Jane had known at Lowood. She was now in charge of the young ward, Adele, who was as lively and curious as Jane had expected, though with a mischievous streak that often led to trouble. Jane found herself more than capable of handling the child, her patience and intelligence guiding her as she worked with Adele on lessons of reading, writing, and etiquette. But it wasn't the duties of governess that kept Jane's mind occupied. It was the master of Thornfield, Mr. Edward Rochester. He was a man of mystery, stern, often brusque, but with a presence that commanded attention the moment he entered a room. Jane had met him only briefly during her arrival, and she found him to be a man of contrasts. One moment distant and cold, the next fleetingly warm, as if something buried deep within him longed to break free. There was something about Mr. Rochester that intrigued Jane, something in the way his eyes held secrets he was unwilling to share. It was not just his dark, intense gaze or his imposing figure. No, it was the aura around him, a quiet sorrow, a burden of some kind that seemed to follow him wherever he went. He was a man who had been shaped by pain, and that pain seemed to echo through the halls of Thornfield. One evening, after dinner, Jane found herself alone in the drawing room, deep in thought about her future, when Mr. Rochester entered unexpectedly. He glanced at her, his gaze unreadable, before he spoke. "Miss Eyre," he said with a voice that held a strange mixture of authority and curiosity. "You are quiet tonight." Jane met his gaze, steady but reserved. "I am always quiet, sir," he chuckled, though it lacked true humor. "I suppose that's true. You have the quiet strength of one who does not reveal all her thoughts." Jane hesitated, unsure whether to speak freely or retreat into the safety of silence. She had learned long ago that to speak too openly could invite judgment, but something in Mr. Rochester's words made her pause. "I have learned," she said slowly, "that there is strength in silence. Sometimes it is what is unsaid that holds the most weight." His eyes softened ever so slightly, though his face remained impassive. "You may be right, Miss Eyre." And with that, he turned and left the room as quietly as he had entered, leaving Jane with a sense of confusion she could not shake. She had only just begun to understand Thornfield's secrets, but she knew deep down that Mr. Rochester's silence was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a man haunted. Days passed, and Jane's thoughts were consumed with him. Her intuition told her there was more to him than met the eye. She saw the occasional flicker of vulnerability, but it was always hidden behind a mask of aloofness. And though she could not quite explain why, Jane felt drawn to him, as if some force beyond her control was pulling her closer to the heart of Thornfield's mysteries. It was only a matter of time before she would discover what lay hidden in the shadows of the house and in the heart of its master. The days at Thornfield passed slowly, but each one brought new layers of complexity to Jane's life. Her days were filled with teaching Adele, maintaining the order of the house, and moving through her tasks with the calm precision she had perfected over the years. But the evenings were different. The evenings brought quiet moments in the presence of Mr. Rochester, and in those moments, Jane found herself both unsettled and drawn to him in a way she did not fully understand. Mr. Rochester rarely spoke about himself, but his actions told a different story. He would often leave Thornfield for days, disappearing into the moors, returning weary and distant, his dark eyes filled with an unspoken weight. His interactions with Jane were at times brief, at times more engaging, but always marked by a sense of unease, as if he was hiding something he could not or would not share. One night, during one of these rare moments of connection, Jane found herself alone with Mr. Rochester in the drawing room, the flickering fire casting long shadows on the walls. Adele had already gone to bed, and Mrs. Fairfax had retired for the evening, leaving Jane and Mr. Rochester in an uncharacteristic silence. "Miss Eyre," he began, his voice low but steady, "you are a woman of few words, but I can see that your mind is never at rest. What do you think about when you sit there staring into the fire?" Jane hesitated, caught off guard by the question. Her mind was always active, always calculating, always analyzing, but she had never shared her thoughts so openly. "I think about many things, sir," she said, her voice calm but guarded. "I think about what it means to live with quiet strength, about the ways in which we hide pieces of ourselves from the world, even from those closest to us." Mr. Rochester's gaze softened, and for a fleeting moment, Jane saw something vulnerable in his eyes, something that made her wonder if, beneath the hardened exterior, he too was struggling to keep his own secrets buried. "And do you think "It is worth it, Miss Eyre?" he asked quietly. "To keep those pieces hidden, to keep our true selves locked away?" Jane thought for a moment before responding. "I believe it is a matter of survival. There are parts of us that the world is not ready to understand, parts of us that are too fragile to be exposed. But in time, we must ask ourselves whether we are truly living or merely existing." Mr. Rochester regarded her silently for a long while, and Jane could not tell what he was thinking. The air between them felt charged, as if something unsaid lingered, waiting to be revealed. Finally, he spoke again, his voice low and full of an emotion Jane couldn't place. "Perhaps we are both guilty of that, of merely existing. Perhaps that is why we both seek silence. It is easier to hide in silence than to confront the truth." Before Jane could respond, the silence was shattered by a strange noise, a loud crash followed by the sounds of hurried footsteps down the hall. Mr. Rochester's face tightened, and for a moment the vulnerability she had seen in him disappeared, replaced by a hard, guarded look. Without a word, he rose from his chair and strode toward the door, but not before casting a glance back at Jane. "Stay here," he commanded. "Do not move." Jane watched as he disappeared into the hallway, her mind racing. What was happening at Thornfield? What secrets was Mr. Rochester hiding, and why did she feel as though they were about to be unveiled? Minutes passed like hours, and Jane sat in her chair, her thoughts tangled with questions she could not answer. She had come to this house seeking more than the quiet life she had left behind, but she hadn't expected to find herself drawn into a mystery that seemed to have no easy solution. And yet, as the minutes wore on, Jane could not help but feel that the answers she sought were closer than ever. Soon, Mr. Rochester returned, his face grim, and his eyes shadowed with something that looked like fear, or perhaps regret. He stopped in front of her, his posture stiff. "Miss Eyre," he said quietly, "there are things at Thornfield that you will not understand, things that have been buried for a long time. But I will not lie to you. You deserve the truth." Jane stood up, her heart racing. "What is it?" "Sir, what is it that you are hiding?" He looked at her for a long moment before answering, his voice barely a whisper. "There is a darkness in this house, Miss Eyre, a darkness that has lived here far longer than I care to admit." Mr. Rochester's words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and Jane felt the weight of them press against her chest. There was a darkness in Thornfield, a darkness he had hidden, perhaps even from himself. The silence in the room deepened as Jane struggled to process what he had said, unsure whether it was the truth or simply the ramblings of a man overwhelmed by his own secrets. For a long moment they stood there in the dim light, neither moving, neither speaking. Jane could see the storm in Mr. Rochester's eyes, the turmoil that seemed to churn just beneath the surface of his calm exterior. He was a man at war with himself, a man burdened by something far greater than she had ever imagined. Finally, he spoke again, his voice barely audible, yet filled with conviction. "You asked me once if I thought it was worth it to keep the pieces of ourselves hidden. Perhaps it is not about worth at all. Perhaps it is simply about survival." Jane's heart raced. She had never expected such a conversation. She had been prepared to face the mystery of Thornfield, but not in this way, not through words filled with sorrow and regret. "Survival?" Jane echoed, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "What do you mean, sir?" Mr. Rochester's face hardened, and for a moment he seemed to struggle with himself, as if debating whether or not to reveal more. He took a step back, as if trying to distance himself from the very emotions that seemed to boil within him. "There is something I have kept hidden for years, Miss Eyre," he said, his voice raw, as if the words themselves were painful to speak. "A secret that has consumed me, that has shaped every part of my life. A secret that I fear will destroy everything if it is ever revealed." Jane felt a shiver run down her spine. Her instincts told her that this was no ordinary secret. Whatever it was far more dangerous than she could ever imagine. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What is this secret that has bound you to this house, to this life?" For a moment, Mr. Rochester did not answer. His face was a mask of anguish, and it was clear that the weight of his confession was tearing him apart. He seemed to hesitate, as though he was caught between revealing the truth and protecting her from it. Then, with a deep breath, he finally spoke the words that would change everything. "I have a wife, Miss Eyre," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "A wife who is locked away in this house, hidden from the world. She has been here for years, kept in the shadows, a prisoner of her own madness." The words hit Jane like a physical blow. She stared at him in disbelief, her mind struggling to make sense of what he had just said. A wife? Locked away? The very idea seemed impossible, and yet there was a dark conviction in Mr. Rochester's eyes that made her question her own disbelief. "He continued, his voice tinged with guilt. "Her name is Bertha Mason. She is my burden, my punishment. Her madness is the reason I live in solitude, why I have never been free. I married her many years ago, believing she was a woman of noble birth. But I was deceived. She was the daughter of a Creole merchant, and she inherited the madness that runs in her family. I cannot divorce her, for her family would never allow it, and if anyone were to know the truth, it would ruin me." Jane stood frozen, her mind racing. Everything she had believed about Mr. Rochester, about Thornfield, about herself, suddenly seemed so fragile, so uncertain. How could he have hidden such a thing from her? How could he have allowed her to come so close to the heart of his secrets without revealing the truth? He seemed to read her thoughts. "You think I am a monster," he said, his voice harsh with self-loathing. "You think I have deceived you, and in some ways I have. But I never intended for you to be drawn into this, into my shame." Jane's heart ached for him, but at the same time, a deep sense of betrayal coursed through her. How could she trust him now, knowing the truth? And yet, beneath the anger and hurt, she also understood the depth of his isolation, the years of torment, of living with a secret so dark it could never be shared with anyone. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Why tell me this now?" Mr. Rochester's eyes darkened. "Because, Miss Eyre, you are the only person in this house who does not see me as a monster. You are the only person who has shown me something beyond pity and fear. But I fear I may have already lost you." The words were like a knife to her heart. Jane had always prided herself on her ability to endure, to face whatever challenges life had thrown at her. But this was different. Could she still see him for the man he was, or had he become something irreparably broken? In that moment, Jane knew she had a choice. She could turn away, leave Thornfield, and reclaim the peace she had fought so hard for. Or she could stay, face the darkness, and see if there was still something worth salvaging in Mr. Rochester's fractured soul. The decision would not be easy, but one thing was clear. Whatever path she chose, it would be shaped by her own silent strength. The night after Mr. Rochester's revelation, Jane lay awake in her modest room, staring at the ceiling, as her mind churned with the weight of the truth. His confession had shattered the quiet world she had built at Thornfield. She had come to the house seeking something beyond the shadows of Lowood, but now she was faced with a new darkness, one that had lived within Thornfield's walls, hidden beneath layers of secrecy and pain. Yet, amid the turmoil, Jane could not simply cast him aside. She had come to know him, truly know him, through his silence, his subtle gestures, his guarded words. She had seen the flickers of vulnerability in his eyes, the flickers of a man who was not just a master of a grand house, but also a man with a tortured soul burdened by a past he could neither escape nor face alone. As the morning light crept through her curtains, Jane rose and dressed, her movements slow, deliberate. She could not run from the truth. She had never been one to flee from difficulty. Her life had been shaped by hardship and survival, but now she had to decide how to move forward, how to face the situation with the same quiet strength she had carried throughout her life. Downstairs, Thornfield seemed unchanged, the house still wrapped in the same silence that had cloaked it for so long. Mrs. Fairfax greeted her with her usual kind but distant manner, and Adele, oblivious to the world, of secrets unfolding around her, smiled brightly as she sat at the breakfast table. But Jane's mind was elsewhere, her heart divided between the love she had begun to feel for Mr. Rochester and the bitterness that the truth had left behind. Later that day, Jane sought Mr. Rochester out, her steps purposeful, though her heart pounded in her chest. She found him in his study, standing by the window, his back to her, lost in his thoughts. He turned as she entered, and for a moment there was a brief flicker of hope in his eyes, hope that perhaps she would offer him some form of forgiveness or understanding. But Jane knew that forgiveness could not come easily, not yet. Not until she had fully confronted the situation, and not until she had made peace with her own feelings. "Mr. Rochester," she said, her voice steady but soft, "I have heard your truth. And now I must ask you something. Why have you not sought help? Why have you hidden her, your wife, in this house all these years?" Mr. Rochester's face darkened, his shoulders tensing. "Because to seek help would be to admit my failure, to admit that I have been trapped by my own mistakes. I married Bertha when I was young, blinded by passion and pride, but I soon realized that she was not the woman I thought her to be. I have kept her hidden because I feared the world would not understand, and I feared that no one would ever forgive me." Jane listened in silence, her heart heavy with empathy and sorrow. She understood the weight of shame, of carrying a secret so burdensome that it threatened to crush every part of one's life. But even as she felt compassion for his suffering, she could not ignore the fact that she had been drawn into his web of lies, into a situation where trust had been shattered. "What will happen now?" she asked quietly. "Will she remain locked away in this house forever?" Mr. Rochester's eyes darkened with despair. "I do not know, Miss Eyre. I have tried everything, but there is no cure for her madness. She is a danger to herself and to others, and I cannot bring myself to take her anywhere else. I fear what would happen if the truth were ever exposed. She is my responsibility, my burden, and I do not know how to free myself from it." Jane stepped closer, her heart torn between understanding and sorrow. She had come to admire Mr. Rochester for his strength, his resilience, but now, in the face of such raw vulnerability, she could not help but question the path he had taken. The man before her was not the proud master of Thornfield. He was a man broken by his own choices, a man who had been trapped by his past and now sought a way to move forward. "I cannot make this decision for you," Jane said softly, "but I will not live in a house where secrets thrive, where silence reigns over the truth. If you wish to move forward, you must face your past, not just for your own sake, but for the sake of everyone around you." Mr. Rochester's eyes flickered with something, regret perhaps, or a glimmer of hope. He stepped forward, his voice low but filled with quiet urgency. "And what of you, Miss Eyre? Where do you stand in all this?" Jane met his gaze, her own heart a quiet storm of emotions. "I stand with the truth. I stand with what is right. I have known my own suffering, and I have learned that it is only by confronting it that we can truly live." For a long moment there was silence between them, the weight of their shared words hanging in the air. Then, without another word, Jane turned and left the room, her heart steady, but filled with uncertainty. In the days that followed, Jane took the time to think, to reflect on what she had learned, what she had seen, and what she had come to understand about herself. She had always prided herself on her strength, on her ability to endure and overcome. But now, for the first time, she realized that true strength was not just in surviving the hardships life threw her way. True strength was in facing the darkness, in confronting the truth, even when it seemed impossible to do so. And perhaps, in the end, it was not the silent strength that had carried her this far that would guide her forward. Perhaps it was something deeper, a quiet courage that came from knowing that no matter how dark the world might seem, there was always the possibility of light. With that thought, Jane made her decision. She would not leave Thornfield, not yet. There was still work to be done, still truths to be uncovered, and still a life to be lived. She would help Mr. Rochester confront his past, and in doing so, she would find her own path forward. Together, they would face the storm that had brewed for so long, and perhaps in the end, they would both find the peace they had been searching for.